I'm Jody Nisnik, and you're listening to So Much More. And after a quick word from our sponsors, my guests, Ben Sternke and Matt Tebbe, and I will be back to talk about how to cultivate a robust faith. Ben Sternke has over 2 decades of Christian ministry experience. He is co-founder of Gravity Leadership and co-pastor at the Table in Indianapolis. Matt Tebbe has been in local church ministry for over 20 years. He is the co-founder of Gravity Leadership and co-pastor at the Table in Indianapolis. Sounds like you guys do a lot of things together, include writing a book, which you both co-wrote, and it is called Having the Mind of Christ, 8 Axioms to Cultivate a Robust Faith. So I'm glad that you guys aren't sick of each other and that you're still hanging out and doing good work for Jesus. So thank you so much for making space to be with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Thanks, Jody.
So you start out your book by talking about going through a bit of a deconstruction process where some long-held stories and assumptions that you had about God and the world just weren't working anymore. So I'd love to start there and have you tell us a little bit more about that. Matt, why don't we start with you? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think I tell a story in the book of preaching regularly and realizing that I had a sermon to preach that I could have preached 2 years ago, but couldn't preach that morning, and felt conflicted between maybe not quite knowing where I stood, but knowing that I used to think these things are true and I'm unsure, or I don't think they're true now. And just that integrity issue or that dissonance inside, it really, really bothered me. So that's what one experience that sort of is a quintessential picture of how that season has been for me. But I think more to the point, and what led us to name these axioms and write this book, was seeing in our own lives, meaning in our own ministry experience together and in the stories of pastors and other friends who we would talk to, the cost that the church in the West was paying for not understanding what love is and how it works. And that took all kinds of manifestations and pictures, whether it was just different scandals in churches, different leaders being put on leave, Christians being hurt, walking away from local churches, those kinds of things. I think all of that contributed to just a sobriety for me of something's not working here, And if we are to be known by our love and we can't even be known by that together, like how is the world going to know that we're Christians by what's their perception of who we are and what we are known by? So all of these things just kind of like, it's not working anymore, but gosh darn it, I can't quit Jesus. And so what are we missing? I think those were the 3 little moves for me.
Good. That's good. Ben, what about you?
Yeah. I mean, similar kinds of thoughts, probably instigated by different events. I think for me, and the story I share in the book, is a series of leaders who were important in my faith formation, important in my journey, but then also it was like things discovered or experienced from those leaders that led me to question, like, wait a second, like, was that really God at work through their ministry? Because man, there's all this stuff that gets revealed later. And so I think I had those questionings about, like, is there a way to do ministry that is rooted in love, or is this just how it is? You know what I mean? Like the old saying, like, this is how the sausage is made. Church leadership is, well, you got to cut some corners and you got to, you know what I mean? I don't know. It's just, I was really disillusioned by that and wanted to, I just felt the same thing of just like, is it possible to like take Jesus seriously as a Christian leader, and root our leadership and our stewardship of these ministries in love? And it felt like at least I'd had enough evidence to the contrary to think that maybe it was possible, which I think helped me to endure and navigate that season of disorientation and deconstruction.
Yeah, you're both saying something very similar, and it has been my experience, as well as many people listening, wondering, surely this isn't the church Jesus really meant for us. It just feels so broken in so many ways, and it's disorienting and it's disheartening, and yet we don't want to give up on Jesus. I love him so much, and I figure there has to be something different.
Yeah.
And so perhaps that's why I resonated so much with your book, because that's really where you're starting this whole process.
Yeah, it really does. I like how you put that, Jody. Just like there's a simplicity and kind of a real humility to that phrase. Just I love Jesus so much. And that was, I think, what it came back to for me. My faith journey and my journey into Christian leadership is rooted in some profound kind of contemplative like experiences that I would say are like with the spirit of Jesus, was what I think tethered me to faith during times of disorientation, to know like, well, actually, it's not just that I know this person from my interpretation of scripture or what people have told me about Jesus or the way that the churches function, but I did feel like I had this encounter with Jesus himself that felt like it tethered me to faith in some way, that felt like I can keep coming back to this in a way.
So you start really at this kind of bedrock axiom. So first of all, I want you to define axiom, because my listeners may use that word all the time, but it is not a word that has been frequent in my language. So tell me, where did that word even come from before we dive into them?
Yeah, I don't know where we decided. I don't know where we landed on the word axiom.
Yeah.
That's lost to history.
Yeah.
but it's
a great word.
Yeah, we don't use it very much, but we have lots of axioms, right? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. These are sayings or statements that are self-evidently true. And the book is of 8 axioms that we're not saying are self-evidently true to us or to other people, but we are saying they are axiomatic to Jesus. So Jesus seemed to function not with these in conscious view all the time, but as assumptions, as like a deep layered belief that makes sense of what we see him doing. So I guess we're trying to name the underlying kingdom logic that Jesus operated in, that if we choose, we can adopt as well, and not from the place of, Bible camp at 7, raising our hand and like agreeing to a statement, but rather deeper in our bones or our operating system, And so we tried to find a word that wasn't freighted with a lot of misunderstanding, that we could then script and assign meaning to in a way that would be helpful to uncover that operational intelligence of Jesus.
Okay, so how did you decide on the 8? Did you have to negotiate? Did you have like 20 and you had to get them down to 8? Like how did you, what was that process like?
Yeah. Well, after I went up, there was this mountain. I went up on this mountain. There was thunder and came down with these tablets.
I've read that story.
Yeah. I think it's in the Bible. No, there was no tablets of stone. There was no commandments.
That's good, because we might have to end the conversation right here.
Yeah. It might be a little bit of a problem. Yeah. So they were worked out over time through Gravity Leadership. We train Christian leaders in spirituality using several tools, that kind of thing. And at the beginning of when we first started doing this, we didn't actually have any axioms. And what we kept noticing though was that there would be a delta, a gap between the assumptions that we realized we were making about Jesus and the assumptions that some people that were trying to go through our training were making. And it caused very different results in terms of trying to engage in the practices and engage in the tools. And we just started asking what's that all about? Like what's going on there? And eventually these things started to come to the surface of, oh, okay. So if we think that God is always present and at work, well, that makes a big difference in terms of how I, deal with a child who's misbehaving. So that axiom is in contrast to, if the child's misbehaving, well, obviously God doesn't have anything to do with this. And the goal is to get them to behave so that God can be at work in their life. But if I think that God may be present and working in the midst of the reasons that they're misbehaving and my response to that, and maybe God is actually here with us, well, it makes all the difference in terms of how you respond to that. So that's one example of how these axioms then began to become important to name then at the outset of our training, to say, oh, this is actually important for us to name. And then it comes back throughout the training. And so these, I think we started with, there were like 6, and then there was 7. And then after we started writing the book, there was another one that we realized is like, okay, this is another one of these things that we have to name that feels timely. So these aren't like eternal truths that are the most important things to say about God for all time, right? That's the joke about the tablets. But I think they are timely words for us and for a lot of the people that we talk to that are like, oh, these name significant shifts in our assumptions that really help to be able to name and notice when that shows up in our life and when it's lacking. And anyway, all that kind of thing. So it was conversations, training, coaching, pastoring, discipling. That's how they emerged.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what they are?
Yeah. So a lot of these axioms may strike you as they're sort of statements, not things that are, with the exception of maybe a couple, aren't very controversial, or really most Christians wouldn't argue about them. The power comes in as we allow them to become part of the bedrock of our being. So axiom 1 is God is love. So it's all about love. Axiom 2 is God is always present and at work. 3 is God is just like Jesus. 4, God meets us in our messy reality. 5, God cares about all of it more than we do. 6, God does the same work through us and in us. 7, God's love always reckons with power. 8, God transforms us through embodied participation.
Okay, so let's start with number 1, because I think it's so foundational. And I read it and I was like, yeah, of course, God is love. So it's all about love. I totally believe that. I totally agree with it. No problem. Yeah. I start reading the chapter and I realize that I don't always live like that's true.
Yes.
So unpack that one for us a little bit, and how this one, they don't necessarily build on each other, but they all kind of intertwine with each other. And it feels like this one is very foundational to all the other ones. Is that right?
It is. Yeah. This one used to be phrased differently, and it was different. It was in a different order, but we did move it to the first and rephrased it in this way to root it in love for those reasons, like you said, that they do all interlock and intertwine, but this one is fairly foundational. And I think it's foundational for the book, but it's also foundational for what Matt and I find ourselves doing through Gravity and really in our church plant as well. And yeah, I think that's the power of it, is recognizing that I wouldn't argue, like you said, Jody, I wouldn't argue about this from a conceptual standpoint, a theological standpoint, but the power of these axioms comes in noticing all the ways that we don't live as if it's true. And so there's a part of us that's like, well, sure, God is love, and I do believe it's all about love. But then the power comes in, oh, well, how many parts of my life do I live as if it really is all about love? And how many ways do we have in just our normal Christian lives, and if you're in leadership or responsibility of any kind, how many times do we actually resort to something else that nullifies love in order to get some job done or do some good in the world? And so there's a lot of assumptions we carry around about love, where theologically we could say, yeah, I believe it's all about love because God is love. But then when it comes to managing my employees, I immediately use a different logic to say, well, how do I get them to do what I need them to do? I mean, we think, well, love doesn't have anything to do with that, like love has to do with sentimentality, or it's good for kids and it's good for marriage and romance and that kind of thing. But it doesn't really help me manage my employees, does it?
Yeah. Yeah. And Ben's indicating here the second problem is that we underestimate the power of love and we don't really know much about it. Right. So if we start talking about love as a definition, I think we're comfortable. Mm-hmm. How's love defined? But if we start talking about it like this, Jody, how does love work? What does love want to do? Mm-hmm. What's the goal? If it's about love, how does that change the goal of our life, the goal of relationships, the goal of our family? And I think that's where it's a little more murky, because we underappreciate, I think, the centrality and importance of love in the New Testament. And Ben's right. It's either sentimental, or it's an interior kind of feeling, or it gets relegated. 1 Corinthians 13 is such a powerful passage, but we 95% of the time only hear that at weddings.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a wedding text. Paul's not even discussing
Right.
husbands
Marriage
and wives
all.
there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the second issue here, is that we don't live as though love is a logic and a powerful logic, and B, we don't really know what love is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ben, when you were talking about, we bring this into the realm of our employee relationships, the word that was coming to my mind is, no, we discard love because we need to control someone. Now I need you to do something. And so there's not time for me to love you. Yeah. And even Matt, as you were talking, I was thinking the difference is love is, there's not a formula. It's not, okay, love is A plus B equals C. Yes. Love is messy. Love means we have to go back to Jesus and ask him about everything. It means we have to be a little slower with our lives. That's hard for us as humans, especially humans that want to get something done.
Yes.
So that pace of love is just a very countercultural pace than we're used to living at. Yeah. I think that's one of the problems maybe that I saw. I'm probably just exposing myself. That's one of the things that I saw as I was reading. I was like, oh yeah, see, I don't operate in love all the time.
Yeah, it's so common. I think we often think the opposite of love is hate. And I think the opposite of love is control. Like one of the things that strikes me about how Jesus expresses God's sovereignty in the Gospels, and even how God expresses God's sovereignty in the Scriptures, is how frequently Jesus doesn't get what he wants with people. And he kind of refuses to control them, even trying to overwhelm their will with influence. He says things like, he looks at somebody lovingly and says, go sell all you have and give to the poor, and lets the guy go away sad without like 3 more paragraphs. He says to Judas, what you're going to do quickly. You know what I mean? There's these moments of, gosh, if I had Jesus's wisdom and forceful charisma, I certainly would try harder to change people's minds. So I think you're right on, Jody.
Yeah. I mean, you see this too in the way that Jesus, I think he's always downplaying some of the most remarkable aspects of his ministry, according to people, like the miracles, for example. Like if you were trying to overwhelm people and get them to do what you wanted to, man, put on the miracle show. That'd be a great way to do it. He just refuses to do it. He's always telling people to be quiet. Don't say anything about this. He's always moving on to the next town. He's always sending everybody out of the room before he raises people from the dead. He's always downplaying all of that. And I think part of it is that he understood the power of those things and didn't want that to overwhelm people in a way that wouldn't be loving. It's fascinating to me.
Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at it. I had not seen it that way before. I love that thought. One of the things that you guys do in the book, which I found super helpful, is you invite us to live into these axioms. Just live like they're true. Just try it. Experiment with this. And so you give some practical exercises. I would love to know, what are some of the favorite ones that you have, or ones that you kind of practice regularly in your own life that help you just remember some of these truths about who Jesus is and how he lives into the world so that we can live into the world in a similar way?
Yeah, I'll name a couple. And there are some practices at the end of the book. I have learned how to notice how anxiety shows up in my body and in my mind. This is a huge work of grace for me, Jody, because up until 10 years ago, I didn't realize I was an anxious person. No one ever taught me how to recognize anxiety. Like it just wasn't something that was part of my childhood growing up, wasn't part of my master's degree. And when I'm able to notice anxiety and there isn't, say, a bomber flying over my house or a tiger crouching in a tree ready to pounce, right? I'm able to then bring some kind of awareness that God is present and at work and he cares about it, all of it more than I do. And that I can just sit with this anxiety and befriend it. Like what it looks like to treat anxiety or fear in faith is that I don't have to control it or fight it or run away from it or believe it. But I can be present to my anxiety with Jesus. Right? Mm-hmm. And this shows up all the time in parenting, because all the time, these little rascals that I'm raising, these little rascals do not do what I want them to do. And so I'm constantly confronted with scripts I tell myself about my power, my powerlessness as a dad, whatever perception other people have about, I'm a pastor and my kids don't listen to me. What does that mean? Right? And so I have so many moments, just regular, ordinary moments where I can notice, okay, I'm angry and I'm anxious, I'm irritated. How would I approach that if I trusted that God was present and at work? In my reactivity to my 14-year-old just being a 14-year-old. So that's one practice. And I know that's not all the practice, but that's one little practice, is just notice that when I'm anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Notice it.
Good.
Yeah, that one's been really helpful for me as well. Transformative, really, just to be able to notice those kinds of things. Anxiety for me as well, anger, noticing when anger comes up in me. And I think one of the, we call them at the end of each chapter, experiments of trust. And one of them that's been helpful for me is at the end of God cares about all of it more than we do, which is Axiom 5. And it's basically an experiment and a practice of essentially just, and the reason it's assuming that God cares about what's bothering me, what's making me angry, or what's making me feel frustrated, instead of trying to get God to care about it. I think my prayer life used to be trying to get God to care enough to do something. And the fact that what I was expecting to have happen isn't happening was evidence that God didn't care. And so I would just resent God for that, for not caring, or I would try to get God to care. So I kind of vacillated between those things. But what I found is, and this, like the imprecatory Psalms, for example, like the Psalms are full of people who are at the end of their rope and like kind of yelling at God, like, God, why don't you help? Like what, like,
where are you?
Where are you? What's going on? You promised to be here. You promised deliverance to your people, and we get defeated after every time our armies go out. We get defeated. So anyway, the Psalms are full of this, and I never knew quite what to do with that stuff. But that's been really helpful for me. Just as I pray those Psalms, I'm able to sort of think about my own ways in which I feel abandoned by God, or I feel like God's not doing something that God seems to have promised me, and so I don't know what to do with that, except like the transformative practice has been, well, I just yell at God for a little bit. You know what I mean? Like that, it feels like a weird thing to say, but that's been a helpful practice for me, is just realizing, okay, if God does care about this, well, then I know I can talk to him about it, and I can ask this question. It's a legitimate question. And God's not scared about that. He's not offended by that. He invites it, actually. And so that's been a huge helpful practice for me.
Yeah, he welcomes that. And Axiom 5 really resonated with me as well, that God cares about it, all of it, more than we do. And I think there was something in processing that one about just his not answering prayers the way we want. There's something in our flesh that we want things, we imagine things should happen in a certain way. And when they don't, or when really horrible things enter into our lives, we have to really go back and wrestle with God. And I think the remembering and the deep bedded truth that he does care about this more than I do is very grounding, especially when there are things that are really spiraling out of our control.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing, Jody? There's got to be a listener who's with us that it's not just like you prayed for the better job and you didn't get it, or man, you really hope this week's weather would be nicer than it was because you had an outdoor party, right? And we've all prayed those prayers and wanted those things. But some of us have lost loved ones untimely. Some of us have gone to churches and loved ones have been hurt there. Some of us have prayed for things that we can't imagine Jesus doesn't want to and haven't gotten them. And that's a different category than me wanting a 66 and sunny day and getting a 56 and rainy day. And I want to legitimize that sense of hurt and longing and confusion and even anger, right? Sadness. And so God cares about all of it more than us isn't meant to promise that we would get what we want if we want the right things. It is to say that somehow the same person who raises people from the dead when they fall asleep that he was preaching, St. Paul, has to leave his buddies sick, has to leave Trophimus sick in Miletus. Prays that he would be better and doesn't get better, right? The same Jesus who raises from the dead weeps at tombs where people die. And so I think there's a deep mystery about the activity of God in the midst of our suffering and the evil in this world. And this axiom is not meant to dismiss that mystery and also the weeping and lament and even the anger that we would need to express faithfully in the midst of that. But it is meant to say sometimes what God is up to, if it's all about love, then sometimes what God is up to is different than what we would think. And because the goal is eternity and the goal is the kinds of persons we become in order to express God's sovereignty of love to the cosmos for eternity with him, that there's a different calculus of what is permitted and what isn't and how that all works. And I don't have the answer key to it. I just want to say this axiom isn't meant to minimize real suffering and pain. And can I just share a quick story, Jody? Ben and I spent about a year working with the same organization, and we had so much hope for it and so much energy for it. And it was the hardest year of our life. And so many people got hurt and so many bad things happened. And so many tens of thousands of dollars were spent moving across country and then moving back across country. And it legit trauma was experienced by people who went through this. And I had questions about God, I felt so clear that you called us to this thing. And it was it was awful. And I'm looking back now, many years later from that, and thinking that was one of the seminal moments in my life where I was in touch with a Christian culture that did not take love seriously. And the damage it did and the hurt it caused unintentionally, but actually. And now I feel like I wouldn't wish that experience on a friend, but I wouldn't trade that experience in my life. And both those things can be true, right? And I think that in God's loving sovereignty, the wrong and evil and bad things that happen, I think that's the story that God's wanting to write. I wouldn't wish this on a friend, but I can't imagine being a person who hadn't gone through that because of what has been born in me from it. Now, maybe you're in between those. Maybe you can say one and not the other, and that's perfectly fine. But I just don't want to give the impression that real pain isn't painful and real evil isn't evil. And I think we just need to embrace the mystery of that and the time needed sometimes to metabolize it.
It's good. It's such a good word. I mean, you're speaking to my heart as well. And really hard things that I've gone through and through a lot of healing and a lot of time with Jesus can say what you are saying. But it does take time and the pain sucks.
Yes.
The going through that process is gut wrenching and that is real. And so is Jesus. And it's just such a testimony of what God tells us, that he wastes nothing in our lives when we surrender it to him. It does not mean those things are good. But God.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean God caused them or engineered them for us. It means that God is able to transform them on our behalf. Yeah. So this axiom isn't meant to say, like, hey, God cares about it more than you do, so stop complaining, you know,
Yeah, it's
or
good.
feel better about it. You know, it's meant to actually enable us to walk through the pain that is so painful. Is if we can walk through it, at least just with a glimmer of hope that maybe God cares about this and maybe God's with me in this, that can make all the difference for us in terms of coming out the other side.
Yeah, it's not a platitude. It is
Right.
a truth that we have to use
Exactly.
to strengthen us to get up every day and keep
Mhm.
following and keep choosing the next right thing, whatever that perhaps little thing is.
Yes. Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah, I am disappointed in this because we are out of time and we're not going to really get to talk about the scripture that we meditated on. But I chose a passage from Mark 3, verses 1 through 5. And I chose that because you have that in your conclusion. And it's this beautiful passage about Jesus, and he heals this man with this shriveled or withered hand, and he heals him on the Sabbath. So he's doing things against the rule book, so to speak. And I just a quick word. Tell us something about that passage. Why did you choose it? Is there something you love about it? Something that it helps you know about Jesus? Just give me a quick word about it.
Yeah, I love the fact that Jesus gets angry here.
Mm.
And I think, again, Jody, this is what we've tried to do. Why is Jesus so angry? What kind of operating system would lead? Because he just asks a question and nobody answers it. He's asking a question to these religious leaders, the people who have power, and it's the Sabbath. And he's asking, is it lawful or permissible to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they're silent. He's silent, I think, and he's angry, I think, because the people with power are using their power to not help people with less power.
Mm.
They're actually using this beautiful Jewish faith to keep somebody away from healing on a day of recreation, right? And two, I think it helps us understand what God's anger is for. God's anger, and the word is actually wrath. God's anger is God's love when it encounters anything that opposes the efficacy of love. So Jesus's anger is unto and on behalf of this less powerful, hurting person, and it's towards the people that are preventing that person from being healed.
I love that. One of the things I appreciate about this story is the simplicity of the request that Jesus makes to the man with the shriveled hand. The simplicity of his request to him is just stretch out your hand. Where Jesus is inviting some vulnerability here. Like the man's faith has to be expressed in a little bit of vulnerability where he, I can imagine him being embarrassed about this hand that doesn't work right. It's misshapen. It's, your instinct is to hide this hand. And Jesus, I don't think he's being cruel, but there is always this invitation. Jesus doesn't sort of do things on behalf of people without their cooperation.
It doesn't zap them.
He doesn't zap. Like if he would, like the religious leaders, he could have zapped them and just said, you know what, you guys are being rascals. I'm going to change it all up. You guys are going to repent now. But he doesn't, right? He invites. And so just as his anger is being expressed, which is also an invitation to these religious leaders to repent and change, he also invites this man with this shriveled hand to say, stretch out your hand. Trust me enough that something might change if you just do this vulnerable act of stretching out your hand. And again, so I see there's just this beautiful interaction, Jesus' invitation, and also this man's trust to say, okay, I'm embarrassed, but I'm going to try this because you asked me to. And he's healed. So,
and I just imagine more the embarrassment, but also perhaps some fear, because there's these opposing people watching him, and he's now going to listen to the guy who's the outcast, who they're looking to shun, take away, and build their case against. And all of a sudden he has to stand and make a choice too.
Yeah.
So
that's a really good point.
Got to be so many emotions happening in that scene. Oh, I feel like we could just keep talking about it. Well, I am really grateful for both of you, Ben and Matt. Thank you so much for making some space for us and for encouraging us today.
Yeah.
Great to be with you, Jody.
Yeah, our pleasure, Jody. Thanks for having us.
Well, friends, I do want to let you know that IVP is graciously giving So Much More listeners 30% off and free shipping for Matt and Ben's book, Having the Mind of Christ. So I do hope you'll go grab it because there's a lot of meat in this book. I mean, we like barely scratched the surface. So I do think it is worth you getting, reading, and thinking about, and even having conversations with friends over. So I hope that you'll do that. I'll put links in the show notes and all the details will be there. Also, how you can connect with Ben and Matt will be there as well. Well, friends, I do also just want to take a quick second to thank the team of Life Audio for their partnership with us. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. There are shows about prayer and Bible study, parenting, and even this one on scripture meditation and thoughtful conversations. So as always, I want to thank you again for joining me and Matt and Ben today on So Much More, because we really do believe Jesus has so much more to say to us. And this is one way we're creating space to listen.